Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And welcome back to part B of our lecture on urbanization and immigration. Now we left off talking about the process of actually entering the United States via Ellis Island and Angel Island for new immigrants. But the reality is, once they leave that kissing post, what happens next? And that's where we're going to start right now. What happens next? The reality is, if you were a new immigrant, let's just say you were from Poland, or from China, or from Italy for that matter, what's the first thing that you want to do? First thing you need to do after you leave the kissing post. So let's just start for a minute with, say you're from Italy. What's the first thing you're going to do after you leave the kissing post? You've gone through all this process, and yes, you were processed like cattle. What is the first thing you're going to do? Now, I ask my students this all the time, and the first answer is, well, find a job. Well, that's great, and yes, you need a job. But something even more immediate. Maybe food, yes. So let's just say it's food. And again, right after that, the next thing you need is lodging. You need someplace to stay. So you're brand new to this country. You may or may not, and probably do not speak the language. Because you're from Italy, you probably speak Italian. So where are you going to eat at? And how are you going to find a place to stay that night? Because you have no idea. There's no Google Maps. There's no Airbnb. You don't have a way to just go online and check out the ratings and see who has the best reviews. So most immigrants do the logical thing. Find a familiar face. Now, this is a big city of millions of people. You're not going to see someone you necessarily know. But you may just hear something that you recognize, like language or physical characteristics, skin tone. And therefore, these new immigrants are very different than the previous immigrants from Western Europe. These new immigrants, especially those from China, but also those from Eastern and Southern Europe, were actually able to maintain much more of their culture. Because as they flood into these urban cities, the first thing they do is they find people that look and sound like them. They will find people who speak Italian. They will find people who speak Polish. They will find people who speak Mandarin. And as a result of that, oh, hey, you speak Italian? Fantastic. Hey, where should I eat right now? Good Italian place? Oh, there's a place you can stay right upstairs. Fantastic. So they can eat, they can find a place to live, and they can use that connection to hopefully find a job. And therefore, they're going to live right there with the people that they first met or very close by. Thus, they tend to congregate in what became known as ethnic neighborhoods or ethnic enclaves. So usually we use the term enclave. So they gather together in these ethnic enclaves, and as a result of that, they may not have to learn English for a very long period of time. They don't have to give up celebrating their cultural holidays and embrace America. They don't need to. Because they live with people who are from the old country. They speak the same, they sound the same, they dress the same, they eat the same. And thus, there's no immediate need to embrace American cultural ideals or American language even. And remember, there's no such thing as an official American language. We just tend to use English, right? It's not a law anywhere. And thus, what you find is ethnic enclaves develop, such as places like Little Italy, Chinatown, Little Tokyo. And these communities provided solidarity. They provided stability. They provided some semblance of normalcy, whereby the first generation arriving may never learn English. The second generation will learn a lot more. By the third generation, they are now considered assimilated and, Americanized. And while they're there, they will live in cramped tenement housing that look something like this. Most families will live in 2 or 3 room apartments, usually several people living in the same room. Sometimes They would even share an apartment with another family. So let's just say, for instance, that you work the first shift for 12 hours. You work from 8 a.m. till 8 p.m. Well, so you go to work, and while you're at work, a whole other family will come and sleep in your apartment. And then you will go home at 8 o'clock. They come in at 8 o'clock and work 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. And thus, you actually share an apartment with two separate families who live on two different schedules. Again, privacy is non-existent. By 1900, remember I told you how many tenement housing in New York City? Well, New York City's Lower East Side, there were 700 people per acre. Think about it, 700 people per acre. That is a higher population density than Bombay, the poorest section of Bombay in India. More people live per square acre in New York City in 1900 than they do currently in the poorest areas of the world. And we won't see improvements for at least 20, 30 years. And then they go to work. They think living's bad? Oh yeah, this is bad. Well, this might just be worse. I'm not going to go into long detail here, but just to reiterate some points about work life. Life sucked at work. How much did life suck in the Gilded Age? Let me count the ways. Poor living, poor working. Remember, these are poor immigrants who lack English language skills. It makes them ripe for exploitation. They worked in the mills, the mines, the sweatshop. They are exploited by management. They are concentrated in industries with back-breaking work. That guy cannot literally stand up. By 1900, first and second generation immigrants constitute more than 96% of the labor force that built the railroads, that worked in the mines, that worked in the meatpacking industry. Remember, 25% of the workforce that worked in steel died on the job between 1906 and 1911. Think about that. Almost 25% of workers who worked in U.S. steel died on the job between 1906 and 1911. Remember, the average work week was 60 hours a week. That's 10 hours per day, 6 days a week. But steel workers worked anywhere from 72 to 90 hours a week. They were required to work a 24-hour shift every 2 weeks, all to make somewhere between $400 and $500 a year. Immigrants were essential workers too. They were essential to the smooth operation of the American economic machine. Well, they were considered essential workers. They had to be there no matter what. Also, someone else can make money. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is not right. Immigrants were essential to the smooth operation of the American economic machine. However, that smoothness of the operation came at a huge price of the health and prosperity of the poor immigrant class. This is that gold-plated crap that will eventually lead to reform in the progressive era of the early 20th century. Now, I told you they were essential workers, right? Yeah. Despite this determination they were essential workers, the uptick in immigration would spur a huge anti-immigrant backlash. We call this nativism. Native-born Americans saw these new immigrants as a threat to their way of life, a threat to their jobs. They're stealing their jobs, stealing their money. Sound familiar, by the way? Yeah. Not much has changed in 100 plus years. And of course, this sentiment was particularly directed at these new immigrants, right? These Eastern European, Southern European immigrants. These new immigrants, nativists maintain that these new immigrants, they couldn't speak English. They had vastly different cultures and some religions, and they were somehow worse. This idea that they didn't speak English and different cultural traditions, different foods, somehow made them worse than the previous immigrants than before? They're humans. They're not worse. They're not better. They're people. But nonetheless, these new immigrants were considered racially inferior, culturally impoverished, and incapable of assimilating. Again, they didn't need to. They lived in ethnic enclaves. There was no need to assimilate. Not to mention, nothing wrong with their culture. Their culture is just fine. And now there's also religious nativism also in here, religious prejudice in this nativism, specifically against Catholic. Most Irish and, of course, Italians were primarily Catholic. There's also anti-Semitic nativism, again, directed against Jewish immigrants. And there was a strong propaganda and strong suspicion that all these new immigrants were criminal. Sound familiar? I recall someone about 4 years ago saying that, Mexico is sending the worst, rapists and murderers. They're not sending their best from, to our country. Someone said that about 4 years ago. The thing is, this is not a new phenomenon. We talk about it today as if it's something new. It's not. This is what was being said back in the 1800s. And so there was this, because of this nativism, there would be a push, a movement to restrict immigration. Now, there was some limited success, right? Because the thing is, big businesses who kind of really ran America, they liked immigration. So did the federal government, because remember, they're kind of in the back pockets. But there would be multiple attempts to restrict immigration during the 1800s. And actually, many presidents would veto this type of legislation. There would be some success, though, on the West Coast. See, on the East Coast, Eastern Europeans were good with them. Remember, most of the industry's in the Northeast, so it made sense. But out West, where there's a little bit less industry at this point, there would be some success, big success, in limiting, restricting Asian immigration. So during the height of European immigration, the United States would begin to ban and bar Asian immigration. You see, many Chinese were coming to California, about 75,000, representing about 1/9 of the state's population, were, in fact, Chinese. And they often worked at lower wages, which, of course, pissed off white workers. And they felt that if we're going to, target some immigrant group to restrict, Chinese would be an easy target, right? They were seen as being more feminine, they were job stealing, and they were an easier target because they were not, quote unquote, white, like some of these Eastern Europeans. At least they looked white. These are Asians, right? And so in 1882, the United States would first pass the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, technically, it was only going to be signed for 10 years. It banned Chinese immigration with the exception of educators and family. Now, in 1892, it would be renewed for another 10 years. In 1902, it would be renewed again. And then finally, as we'll talk about when we get to our World War I lecture, it'll actually be cemented in 1917 as a kind of a permanent exclusion, all the way through the 1940s. So yes, from 1882 to the 1940s, 60 years, Chinese were excluded from entering the country. So students, merchants, certain teachers, and then, of course, direct family members. And then in 1907, the United States and Japan would enter into what was called the Gentleman's Agreement, whereby Japan would prevent immigrants from coming to the United States. Now, essentially, it was Japanese exclusion. However, it was not called that because Japan was a much more industrialized nation than China was. In order for Japan to save face, the US President Teddy Roosevelt allowed Japan to take control and say, you do your job and you prevent immigrants from coming to our country. Otherwise, we will ban you and make you look bad. So in other words, so the United States wouldn't appear like they were demeaning Japan. Japan agreed to save face and prevent their immigrants from leaving and going to the United States. But either way, by 1907, The two, most prominent Asian countries, China and Japan, were effectively banned from entering the United States. And of course, you see the idea. This is a more modern one. And again, the story has not changed in 150 years. Big business wants cheap, disposable labor to keep the profits, to keep the economy, and then these are essential to the humming of the economy. And of course, nativists, in this case, immigration restriction, in this case, ICE, wants to deport the same exact immigrants. Again, nothing has changed. Now, that's the immigrant story, right? And this is, but I started this lecture off by saying there were some good things, right? I said, hey, there's some positives that came out of the Gilded Age. And thus far, we pretty much all talked about the crap. So let me spend a good 5-10 minutes here and talk about a few positives. Because when you move away from that downtown urban center and into that suburb, right, these new suburbs, we start seeing that we have a new urban middle class, an upper class. And these office workers, these managers, these company owners themselves, they increasingly will live in the suburbs on the outskirts of the city. And of course, they will largely be white. And this is where you start forming what we now iconize as the nuclear family. They move away from having multiple families or multiple generations living in one household. No, you live with two parents and their kids. No grandparents, no extended family, no in-laws, no, just that. And they begin to use their excess wealth and excess time to enjoy new leisure entertainment events. Things like sporting events. Again, this is the era in which baseball gets its start, in which college football gets its start. This is the era in which basketball will start getting its start. And they start going to things like baseball games in New York, in Boston. And what they want to prize more than anything else is their orderly, calm, clean households. They don't have to worry about fending off disease that is rampant in the inner cities. They can just enjoy a clean, healthy living, away from the riffraff, away from the poverty, away from all those so-called dirty immigrants. We start seeing new things like prepared food, things like Quaker Oats, Campbell's soup, Jell-O, Cracker Jacks go to baseball games. New appliances like self-working washing machines. But within this new urban, suburban community, middle-class life, they also develop a very strict culture and moral code known as Victorianism, named after Queen Victoria of England, interesting enough. And so, named in honor of Britain's Queen Victoria, that had emerged in Britain back in the 1830s, 1840s, but arrived in the United States. And again, it happened in Britain, 1830s, 1840s, as a way to tame the urban industrial society. And it jumps across the ocean in the late 19th century for the same reason. Because when they look at industrial society, it's dirty, it's full of riffraff, vile, despicable, almost subhuman living, right? Disease, poverty. And so they embrace this Victorianism to kind of rise above all that dirtiness in the city centers. And along with this, they emphasize orderliness, cleanliness, proper living and behavior, moral living, sobriety, self-control, and of course, sexual modesty. Women were seen as pure vessels before God and man. And they were devoid of any carnal sexual desires. Women were chaste and pure. They dressed in the most fashionable outfits there, which of course were tight corsets that wrapped around their stomach areas. This was by design. It would accentuate two areas of their body because it was super tight around their stomachs, right? And they do this to accentuate parts of their body. The first one being their bosoms. Why? Because they had to be able to feed the children. when breastfeed the children. And of course, their hips. They need to accentuate those hips to attract a male, a husband, and they want to show that we have good childbearing hips. Because they want to promote this image of women as childbearers. That's the point of sex, procreation. The other thing that became very popular, that was for the women. What about for the boys? Well, to emphasize and enforce this idea of chaste, of chastity, of purity, of not lustful sex, of sex only for procreation, one of the popular outcomes of this era was actually circumcision. You gotta realize, for most of the world right now, circumcision is not something that is done in most of the world. It's either a religious thing, it's part of the Jewish religion, or it's found in the United States. It's a cultural thing here, though. And I only know this stuff, and something I never studied out a long time ago, but I have a son who's he's just over 1 year old now. And when I was researching, because this is what I do, I research, I'm a historian. I began to look at it, it's like, well, should he be circumcised or not? And trying to understand, well, what are the pros and cons of it? Or why do we even do this? Is it medically necessary? Is it actually cleaner? Is it healthier? Does it change things? And what I found out was circumcision, while yes, in the Bible, is a Jewish tradition, before God cut the foreskin off the boy, was actually not something done in most of U.S. history. In fact, it didn't start really coming back to be in vogue until the Gilded Age as part of Victorianism. And it was part of the idea was that if you cut the foreskin off the boy, it will make it less sensitive. And therefore, a boy may not be as inclined to be a sexual deviant or a sexual pervert or to sleep around. And so it was part of that Victorian chastity and purity from which the circumcision became the thing. And of course, they didn't say it this way. They didn't come out and say, well, we're going to do circumcision to prevent, a boy from being so sensitive. No. It was done, they said it for cleanliness purposes. And again, the cleanliness, right? It points to that idea of Victorianism, be healthy, orderly, and clean, prevent disease. And so it came under that auspices of Victorianism. And so for women, it was all about the accentuating the bust and the hips, wearing the corset. And of course, be fully clothed, don't, covered up, don't show any ankle or elbow because that might make a boy go awry. And for the boys, though, it was about circumcision. And of course, we still now, 150 years later, it is still just kind of the norm that boys all get circumcised when, medically speaking, it's actually not that big of a deal. And again, in modern day. So again, Victorianism, this middle class culture that develops, that becomes kind of the norm for, well, most of society, most of the United States culture, despite it was actually only a small group of people that developed this and maintained this culture. And there's one more area that we find, and that is education. Because we will see the two sides of public education here. So between 1870 and 1920, we will see the number of pupils in public schools rise from 7 to 22 million. We see a huge increase in number of public high schools, number of college students, number of higher ed institutions, and of course, number of faculty. Why is this? Well, there became a new emphasis on public education and higher learning. Remember, we want higher learning, higher education, but remember, this is only for white, middle, and upper class people, right? This is not for your average person working in the factories. So higher education was seen as a way to perpetuate good managers, good business owners, that white-collar skilled jobs. And so the average working class factory worker could not go to higher education, college, and get these type of degrees because they were working 84 hours a week in the steel mills. Remember, again, child labor laws, they're starting to work at age 10, 12 years old. And so there's no opportunity for most immigrants or most working class to get to higher education. So while it is expanding, it's only expanding to a small pool of people, these white, suburban, middle and upper class families, which allows them to perpetuate their wealth and standing because these are the wealthy who are already wealthy that send their kids to college. It perpetuates that wealth inequality gap that, well, how much does life suck in the Gilded Age? Let me count the ways. Wealth inequality. Remember, a handful of families control all the wealth, all tangible assets. But there was a push for public education for the working class even. So let me bring this straight to you now. Here's a story. There was a man by the name of Horace Mann. Now, Horace Mann went on a honeymoon to Prussia, which, if you don't know, will be modern-day Germany. And he was on his honeymoon in Prussia, and he saw their public education system at work in this Gilded Age period. Now, this is when Prussia's building nationalism, going to build up to become a military power, and eventually lead to World War I. But in the 1800s, again, this is before the war starts, this is many years, Horace Mann's there, and he marvels at the public education system in Germany. That all these young boys, they're learning the German language, they're learning the German history, they're learning how to write, they're learning all these skills to be productive German members of society. And he marveled at this. And so he returns. And again, of course, in Prussia, the goal was to create good soldiers that eventually will fight in World War I. But when he comes back to the United States after his honeymoon's over, he ponders this and he thinks, man, this is a really good idea. Now, we don't need the military part of this, but what about public education for the masses? And so he organizes what was called the Committee of 10. Now, you might think, if you were thinking properly, that he would gather together some intellectual minds from higher education and formulate a way to implement this in the United States. You'd be wrong. He gathered this committee of 10, which are including 10 members who were considered captains of industry. And they gathered together in this committee of 10, all higher millionaire businessmen. They formed this committee of 10 to design what public education should look like. And they decided that public education should teach basic skills, such as how to read a manual, how to follow instructions, how to do basic small math, so reading, writing, arithmetic. And if you do this, you will ensure a good, stable, quality workforce for your factories. Why is this important to businessmen? Why would businessmen get behind this? What do they care? Well, see, there was a problem with industrialization. And the problem was, you may have a factory in, say, Boston, and also one over here in Cleveland. And the people in Boston are a little bit smarter than the people over here in Cleveland. And so when they build this newfangled technology like a self-working washing machine over here in Boston, it works really well. But those people who are dumb over there in Cleveland don't do as good of a job, and the quality suffers as a result. And so for businessmen, what they want is to have quality assurance. They want to have a standard of quality that no matter where this self-working washing machine is built, Boston, Cleveland, that will be the same quality. So to ensure that, they want to make sure that their workers then have basic skills like how to read a manual, how to take instruction, how to do basic math calculations. And so they developed this idea of reading, writing, arithmetic. These are the basic skills. And then they added to that, of course, they should learn the history of our country. Because remember, these are mostly immigrants who don't know the history of our country. And you can use that then to create good American citizens who are proud to be American. Then they said, well, let's see. We got the skills now, the subjects, right? Reading, writing, arithmetic, and social studies. Let's see. How else can we train them? Here's what we're going to do. We're going to put students, young people, in a classroom, and they're going to work on one task, one subject, so reading, for about 45 to 50 minutes. Then a bell's going to ring, and they're going to do another task. This time they're going to do writing for 45 or 50 minutes. Then we're going to have a bell ring, and they're going to turn over, and they're going to do another task, math, for another 45, 50 minutes. Ding! They're going to turn and do a fourth task. In this case, social studies, history, for 45 to 50 minutes. And then, ding, the bell's going to ring, they're all going to go home. And next morning, they arrive at school, the bell rings, ding, they do their first task of reading once again, and so on and so forth. Why? Because that's exactly what you do when you work in a factory with machines. You do your task for a given amount of time, the same task, until the bell rings. Then you change your task to the next task. Public schools were set up to create good factory workers who were compliant and with just enough skill to provide good quality manufactured goods. But if they work such long hours, they will never be able to go on to higher education. And of course, I would hope you all recognize that is still the basis of our education system today. We have not innovated. Yeah, we've added art to it and some, other things like music. But think about it. What are our core subjects? Reading, writing, math, social studies. Nothing has changed in 150 years. Nothing. We still work on a bell system. We all sit in straight rows. Now we're trying to deviate a little bit from that now, but we sit in straight rows. We have a teacher up front. The teacher teaches. You do your test for 45, 50 minutes. Ding! Go next class. If the coronavirus pandemic has taught us nothing, is that we need to innovate. Online education is an innovation that can provide students flexibility, that they could work, they could do other tasks, they could go outside and play when it's nice out in the daytime, do their work at night. That's innovation. That's change. This is an opportunity for change. Because we've had the same education system built to make good factory workers since the 1800s. But I digress. That's for another time, another story. Great debate to have in class sometime. So obviously here, the middle and upper classes in the suburbs are having it pretty good. Their quality of life is drastically increased. But there are still enormous social problems in the cities. Disease, death, poverty, hunger. These are realities are underscored by the excesses of capitalism in the Gilded Age, the dark underbelly of industrialization and urbanization. And as we turn our attention now to the end of the century and into the 20th century, we will see there's a growing consensus that the inequalities of the Gilded Age need to be addressed. That gold-plated crap, that crap needs to be cleaned up. But we'll go on in different lectures. So for today, take care, and until next time, bye-bye.